All right, everybody, we're going to begin. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm holding this up to explain this. I had a non-interesting accident, but I have to keep my leg elevated, so please pretend you don't see it. The camera's going to frame it out in any case. I'm delighted to have Mark Royce of General Motors and Ken Washington of Ford, and we're going to be discussing an update on the driverless car. And the reason this is interesting to me, this is my third attendance at KentPresents, and each year we've had discussions about driverless cars. What has changed, I think, is that in the previous years we were really looking at it from a Silicon Valley kind of focus. There was a sense of gee whiz and wonder, and weren't those world changers out in Silicon Valley, the Googles and the Teslas, weren't they really thinking through how to change and disrupt our world and put us into vehicles that were unlike any that we've known before? And we were calling them the driverless car. I heard a comment recently, or picked up a comment that I read in Wired, that made the point that when the automobile was invented, they were first referred to as horseless carriages, because the reference point people had for the things that they got around in were carriages, but now they didn't have horses. And the writer pointed out that we're doing the same thing with driverless cars, that once they take form, we're not going to call them driverless cars anymore. We don't know what we're going to call them. If you want to have a contest to make up a name, perhaps we could do that a little bit later on. But before we get there, we want to see what the steps are that we're going to have to take to get from here to there. And so it's a pleasure to have these two gentlemen and experts to bring the Detroit point of view to this. And by that I mean they represent what one might call legacy automobile makers, and legacy not as a dirty word, but legacy to say they've been around a long time, and that they definitely represent a past that we've gone through to get up to this point. But it's really clear, and this is what they're going to be talking about, that both of these companies are determined not to be left behind, but to grab the challenge of this driverless car thing, this mobility vehicle, and be leaders in it. So I wanted to give each gentleman a few minutes just to talk about what's happening at his company. So Mark Royce, why don't you start? Tell us what exactly your title is at General Motors so that we understand that.
Sure, it's Executive Vice President of our global product group and President of Cadillac. So I have all of everything except marketing and sales basically in the company, so that's what I do. What we're looking at here from a General Motors standpoint is a vision of what we call 0, 0, and 0. So that's really 0 crashes, 0 congestion, and 0 emissions. And so that's our beacon, that's our light for what we're doing and the way we're doing it. And you might have seen the latest investment by Softbank, which was $2.2 billion into our autonomous vehicle activity, which we have created around the cruise automation business that we have out in San Francisco. But also, I think we're really the only company that is really taking and integrating autonomous vehicle technology into the mainline car platform itself. In fact, designing around the electrical architecture in the car is being integrated with the software as it's being developed, instead of a top hat, if you will, being applied to many different vehicles. And that's a big deal for us, because we have a platform called Bolt, which is our roughly 240-mile electric vehicle that we introduced here a while back. And so that's our first platform that we're integrating that with. So that again, the batteries and the electric vehicle piece of that is 0 emissions, and it is something that we're very proud of from a performance standpoint, and the validation we got from Softbank was incredibly important too. Apart from that, we have what's called Super Cruise on the road today in Cadillacs, which is sort of a level 2, 3 type autonomous vehicle system from an SAE standpoint, which still has the driver in the car, but takes away all the fatigue on long trips on highways that have been mapped from a LiDAR standpoint all over the United States. So in fact, we super cruised here today, which was great, which is hands-free, legs-free driving, and it monitors your vision and pupils so that it knows you're not asleep at the wheel and you're attentive. So it's a great assist.
If you are asleep at the wheel, what happens?
Yeah, there's an escalation process. And the escalation process starts with seat vibration and escalates all the way through if you're having a heart attack or having a medical condition. The car will actually, through OnStar, know this and pull the car off and stop the car. So it's quite a system.
And just to finish up your opening presentation, I think maybe I threw you off your game by interrupting.
No, it's okay.
Where do you see the company being in 5 years in this business?
I think 5 years, we've announced that we're going to have a fully autonomous network in operation in 2019, so next year we will deploy that. And so that'll be the transportation as a service piece of autonomous driving, and we're already producing cars without steering wheels or pedals in our Lake Orion plant with our autonomous system. So we're making the cars for it right now. We're testing them in San Francisco, which is by far the most difficult environment in the world to do, and then also in Phoenix and now in Detroit. So we've got 3 places where we're testing and validating, and then we'll present our safety case, and then we'll deploy. So that's where we are in 5 years. 10 years, we're working on fuel cells. We've got a partnership with Honda to make fuel cells. So the fuel cell piece of this will start in the military and government applications of that, where it is highly desired. And then the electrification piece of this, we announced that will be in 2022, deploying our new, actually it'll be a little before that, but our new, all new dedicated fully electric architecture for profit across all the brands in General Motors globally. So that's the next 5 to 10 years.
Ken, your turn. What about Ford?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. It's a return trip for me to KentPresents, so it's always great to be here. Thank you. So let me start with kind of rolling the clock back a little bit. And I love that, John, you opened with the comment about the horseless carriage, because it's really important for us to remember that innovation and bringing about really revolutionary change that impacts society in a significant way is not new to the automotive industry. If you roll the clock back over 100 years, you saw that one of the most important innovations of our time that actually put vehicles within reach of the everyday man and woman. So the moving assembly line, which was really a huge deal for society at the time. So this is sort of built into our DNA for how to bring these big technological revolutions to the masses. And so I wanted to start with that because that's exactly how we're viewing the application of the technology inflections that are making autonomous vehicles all the buzz today. You have to ask yourself, why are we talking about it so feverishly today and we weren't 15, 20 years ago? Well, the reason is because the technology has grown up and made it possible to stitch together advanced sensing, advanced computing, advanced artificial intelligence, and then the systems architectures to bring all that together at a reasonable cost and a reasonable package to be able to pull it off. And so our vision at Ford for autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars is to make that available for the masses and to do it in a way that actually enables it to be a trusted ability to make smart vehicles available to you in a world that we recognize as smart. And the reason that's important to us is because we all live and work and play in a world that has intelligence built into it in lots of different dimensions in our lives. And so when we think about bringing autonomous vehicles to life, it's not just about putting a robot in a car and taking the driver away. It's about building the intelligence into it so it can actually improve the ecosystems in cities. And so we're working with cities to reimagine the mobility system so that when you want to go from one place to another in urban environments, you can do that with less friction. You can do it in a way that you can actually build value into your life. It'll transform the way businesses work. It'll create new value propositions for our business partners. And it'll make life in the cities better. Because we know that in the next 10 to 15, even 5 to 10 years, that the majority of the population on the planet are going to live in these large cities. And they already are are in a condition that is very difficult to have a good experience, particularly during rush hour times. So we want to be able to introduce technology for the masses so that that actually gets better. So the way that's translating into our plans and strategies is we're taking advantage of our expertise in advanced robotics. We've invested in a company that is now quite large called Argo that is building the robot brain for our car, for our autonomous vehicle. And then we recently announced the integration of our Argo autonomous vehicle software team with the rest of our autonomous vehicle integration team into a business unit that's wholly owned by Ford. And that's going to give us the ability to accelerate that, bring it to a product and to the set of services that includes the services that you would actually have access to when you're riding in an autonomous vehicle. Now, the last thing I'll share is our long-term plan. And our long-term plan is to take that and to introduce it into the right urban environments that have benefited from these conversations and these designs. And the first one that we've announced is Miami. We're going to bring our autonomous vehicle to Miami initially, and then we're going to expand from there. We haven't announced the next cities, but that'll be coming very soon. So the thing that I'd like to leave you with is that this is not just about autonomous vehicles, it's about smart mobility and about how the mobility services will change businesses, change the way cities operate. We call it a transportation operating system or the transportation mobility cloud that's going to enable these new business ecosystems to thrive and be successful. It's the modern day equivalent of the moving assembly line is the way I like to think of it.
So Ken, you've made it clear that Ford is focusing on cities, and I know that Google's Waymo project has had vans out on highways going at 60 miles an hour. You're not talking highways. This focus on cities is very, very, very deliberate. And does that literally mean that you're working within a speed limit, for example?
Initially, yes, that's right. And the thing that impressed upon all of you is to recognize that the autonomous vehicle, the fully autonomous vehicle that people will ride in as a service that operates in and around cities, and will be connecting to airports and other regions near the city as well. To do that without a driver in it, so it's a fully dedicated, purpose-built vehicle that has, much like what Mark shared that they're doing with General Motors, we're doing similar strategy, building a purpose-built vehicle that's designed for fully autonomous operation. It's an extremely hard task, and to do that at very high speeds is extremely difficult. In fact, it extends beyond the sensing capabilities that exist today. But we're not giving up on that opportunity long term. Long term, we recognize that you'll be able to do that kind of higher speed solutions by taking advantage of intelligence in the environment and intelligence on highways, communication between vehicles, and other innovations like that we know are coming.
Mark, as I said in the beginning, if we were having this conversation, we did have this conversation last year or the year before, it was so very much focused on Silicon Valley's getting into this field. And there's also talk of Amazon and delivery. So, in a sense, focus coming back to Detroit. But what advantages that are both obvious and not obvious do the legacy car companies have in getting into this field?
I think there's probably a lot of cash in some of the tech companies. We all know that. So that's obviously a pretty big advantage when you think about it. But then we've concentrated on really delivering an integrated vehicle, which the safety case for this is something that's vital to how it behaves, but also how it fails, and what are the redundancy dialed into that, and then what is the cybersecurity net and the attack surface of a car that is an autonomous vehicle, which brings the possibilities from the cloud, the sky, the municipality, all of that in and out of the car very quickly. The attack surface is very, very different. If you have that attack surface not integrated into the core.
I don't know what you mean by attack surface.
It's where could people hack the car?
Oh.
Okay, so the possibilities of hacking the car. So possibility of hacking the car could be a connection to an app that is coming in and out of the car to buy coffee or fuel. Those are all potential attack surfaces. The attack surface of actually the car itself from the sensor standpoint. These cars have a lot of sensors on them. There's that attack surface. So it's very different than a car today in terms of what we see as some of the connections for insurance companies that people put into the ALDL in the front of the dash, which is actually not recommended, but that's an attack surface.
Yeah,
so
not that anybody would think of hacking a car or
no.
anything like
no,
that.
well, there's people,
I hope you all detected the sarcasm in that.
Yeah, well, we hire people to do that on a regular basis.
Really
so, but that's a key difference, and I also think that automakers bring 40%, and I'm sure that this is happening at Ford too, but 40% of the 38,000 people in product development in General Motors have 5 years or less and are software-based engineering people. So when you think about making a car, sure, we have people that do the bodies, they do the chassis, they do some of the propulsion, they do the interiors, they do the seats, they do everything you touch. The people who are integrating that with an autonomous vehicle structure inside of the car is where we're going to unlock the magic of safety and high production.
Your advantage for both of you is in building the car. You know how to put a car together and do it effectively and quickly, but software is the big part of it. But do you share that? Do you have that advantage in the software side of things as well?
Yeah,
go ahead, Ken. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to add on to what Mark is saying. In fact, I want to even say it maybe even stronger. I really want to debunk this notion that there's a Silicon Valley, strategic advantage because of their software expertise and kind of their innovation mindset. Because, quite frankly, I think, I know that the automotive industry, at least Ford, has a very active process and presence in Silicon Valley. And so this isn't an either or, it's an and. And so when we got serious about bringing autonomous vehicles to the masses and democratizing the future of mobility for everyone, we knew we had to tap into the Silicon Valley ecosystem. We have over 400 people in our Silicon Valley laboratory, and we work with Silicon Valley tech startups. In fact, the company that's helping us build the open ecosystem for additional digital services and what we call the Transportation Mobility Cloud is a spin out from a technology company that started in Silicon Valley. It's a company called Automotive that we acquired. And so our advantage is really the know-how of tapping into a broad supply base, a broad ecosystem of innovation globally, and then integrating that together and realizing it in a very sophisticated, complex system that we call a car. And in the case of autonomous vehicles, we have to remember that there's a vehicle, an autonomous vehicle. And so we understand how to do the systems integration, how to do the safety analysis, and then how to bring all the players together to make that happen at scale and in a way that's secure and in a way that's trustworthy. And so there's no way a startup or any other tech company that doesn't have that kind of background and reach into the supply base and the technology ecosystems globally could pull that off. And that's why you're seeing now all the energy focus on the pairing of technology companies with auto OEMs like Ford and General Motors.
Many years ago, I think back in 2007, I did a report for Nightline about that year's concept cars coming out of General Motors, and I made a visit out and drove around with one of your executives in a sporty little number, and we were talking about the future. And these autonomous vehicles were not in any way on the radar or part of the conversation. It didn't come up in my questions, it didn't come up in things he was talking about for the future. So I'm curious to know, just in terms of your internal culture, where was the moment that somebody said, we've got to start thinking about these driverless cars? And did that person sound a little bit crazy in the beginning? I mean, how did that just get processed? You're already smiling, Ken. So.
Well, I'll start, and I'll certainly love to hear what Mark has to say as well. But so in our culture, the important thing is for us to hold in our heads the ability to think about the now and the near and what we call the far all at the same time, and to give all three of those time dimensions the kind of attention and nurturing that they all deserve and require. And so in the case of autonomous vehicles, while you didn't hear a lot about it in the press and there was no dialogue and discussion about it, say, even 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I can assure you that there was a team inside of Ford, because that team worked for me, that was working on designing the FAR and thinking about the FAR of autonomy and robotics and advanced software and what it would mean for the future of automotive. Now, we weren't ready yet to talk about it publicly. In fact, it wasn't real enough for us to accelerate the investment in it. Now, had we been prescient, maybe we would have made that transition earlier. Mm-hmm. But the important thing was we planted the seed early and we kept it alive and nurtured it so that when we were ready to accelerate, we had a seed from which we could grow. And for me, it's very important that we keep that culture of keeping these kernels of research available. And so in my job at Ford, I'm the Chief Technology Officer, and I oversee our FAR research portfolio, as well as the delivery of our near-term technology into our vehicles. And I make sure that those two, near and the now and the FAR, all three of those, can survive and be successful all at the same time. And there comes a time when, you just kind of realize that it's time to accelerate. And the moment for us at Ford when we made that decision to accelerate was when we started looking at the pretty impressive early successes that Google was experiencing with their early foray into autonomous
So Google actually
vehicles.
was kind of a wake-up call internally.
It was a bit of a wake-up call for us, and we realized that we're not going to be able to be credible if we don't accelerate our efforts here. And that's when we made the investment in Argo and decided to stand up a separate group to really drive the acceleration of our software.
And how about at GM, Mark? Do you recall a sort of period of time when it began to become seriously into focus?
I do. First of all, our footprint's a little bit different than Ken's, back to the prior conversation on where we get talent. We don't take talent necessarily out of Silicon Valley, but we go to the second most recruited university of Silicon Valley, which is up in Waterloo, Canada, where we have an incubator and a software development site. So we have that site. We have a site in Israel where we develop a lot of our proprietary software. And of course, we have Cruise in San Francisco, and then we have Warren, Michigan. And between those tech centers, we are developing the software-based platform for the future. And I can remember back to the second question, which is around when did we start looking at this? We started looking at this on the original concept cars in the 1950s that were called Firebird 1, 2, and 3. They were autonomous vehicles. We then competed in something called the DARPA Challenge, which is in more recent history, where we actually won that, which was an autonomous vehicle competition.
That was out in the desert?
Yes, yes, it was, and it was a Chevy Tahoe.
Yeah.
So we won that with a team from Cornell and a couple other universities. Well, guess who went to Google to do the autonomous car programs? Were our DARPA team. So at that point, we said, okay, we're in. This is going to be real. We're gonna start looking at how we do it. So
that challenge that you won was only 6 years ago. Something.
No, it was a little.
It's just 2007. Was the original DARPA.
That's right.
There was a desert challenge and an urban challenge. Right. Both Ford and GM had teams, and but they were through partnerships with the universities, and we had a team there as well. And what's interesting, if you look at the DARPA Challenge, people that were participating, they formed the kernel of a lot of the thought leaders that are now driving the autonomous vehicle revolution at Ford, GM, and other companies. Brian Selesky is the lead of our Argo AI software development team, and he was on the CMU team. Yeah. And he was also the number 2 guy at Google leading their autonomous
That first DARPA Challenge, though, was I mean, I forget, there may be 12 or 15 entrants, something like that, and most of the cars flipped over and went off into the desert, and it didn't look that promising from the beginning, and yet from that seed, not that long ago, both of your companies are going in billion-dollar ways into this. Yeah.
Well, it was a very important moment in time for the autonomous vehicle program, and because it made us realize that it was feasible, but number 2, and most importantly, it made us realize that it was an extremely hard problem. And it had to be approached with really sophisticated robotics technology.
Why is it so hard?
It's so hard because it's what we call an inherently wicked problem where you have unpredictable actors because you have people involved, and you can't solve it's not a closed system, so you can't solve a set of closed equations for it. Unpredictable things happen. It's actually quite easy to solve the first 80 or 90% of the autonomous vehicle task. To get a vehicle what we call localized on a road is pretty straightforward because all you need is a prior map of that road. You need a pretty decent sensor that you can get with relatively inexpensive cameras. But to be able to see far enough to be able to see what might be coming at you and to be able to know how to localize when it's dark or when things are not easy to see with relatively inexpensive cameras, you need more expensive LiDAR sensors. It's hard to make a LiDAR.
LiDAR is
light detection and ranging. It's a laser that shoots high frequency light, basically, and then it reflects back, and you detect it, and it tells you what it just saw. Kind of the way our eyes work, but with lasers.
And LiDAR
instead.
can give you a three-dimensional picture.
Gives you a 3D picture of the world. That's actually the easy part. The hard part are all these unpredictable things that can happen, like motorcycles splitting lanes, or people walking unpredictably, or looking down at their cell phones and then deciding instantly that they don't, they actually want to walk across the road, or.
I would differ on that.
So
I think we can teach. We have our cars in San Francisco that will actually recognize a raccoon or someone who's having problems on the street and deal with that. I would say the biggest challenges, I think is the question, the biggest challenges we see in this right now in our deployment is centers around the quality of the LiDAR sensor and the ability to short-range detect radar. And the difference between radar and LiDAR will be different in weather, it will be different in distance, and it will be different in performance because of that. And so if you look at the company strategy on what we're going to do about that, we're not probably going to go out and find a company, to Ken's point, that is readily available to solve those problems. The problem on LiDAR right now is it's basically a rotational mirror and a laser and an orientation that it was never designed to perform in. So it's not automotive grade in terms of the cost, in terms of the orientation, and in terms of how many that you put on the car. And so the challenge is to get that more into a solid state instead of a rotational, non-constant environment of the automobile that it's deployed into. And so if you look at that and you say, okay, what are those problems and what is the value to the company when we develop the business around autonomous vehicles, it's going to be solving those in a proprietary manner so that we are ahead of the curve on cost and performance than anybody else. And so that's the approach we're taking on that. And a lot of big decisions have to be made in terms of what you vertically integrate and what you make, both in the battery arena, and the LiDAR, and the radar, and the sensing arena on AV. And so those are the key decisions that we're focusing on today to be able to win from a performance, redundancy, and cost standpoint when we deploy.
It's enormously complex. I mean, it sounds like moonshot stuff.
It really is. It's really a moonshot. But what I love about this conversation is that it's clear that there are very important differences between how we're approaching the development of this wicked problem and how General Motors is approaching it, and Waymo is approaching it differently yet. But there are some common elements to it. But what I love about it is, history teaches us that when you have very difficult problems like this to solve, and you've got a lot of really smart people and dedicated, focused, well-resourced companies going after solving that problem, history teaches us that the problems definitely get solved. And so then the question is, once you solve the problem of how to put the robot brain in the car successfully, then what? That's why we think it's very important that the then what question gets answered in a manner that actually serves society, in a way that makes the introduction of these robot cars into society better, makes society better than it was before you had them, right? So you have to ask yourself the question, was my life in living and using transportation services, if you live in a city, was it better or is it worse before or after the introduction of these new ride services like Lyft and Uber? Some people's lives is better, some people's lives is worse. And so, because they need to be designed to actually work.
So I have a very, very practical perhaps picayune question in that regard, but 20 years from now, is anybody going to have a driver's license anymore? Will any of us actually be required to ever know how to drive a car?
I think you absolutely will, and I think some of the problems. I think Ken, you probably feel the same way. It's frustrating to see some of the coverage of autonomous vehicles, and even to some extent electric vehicles around. Either we're going to have autonomous vehicles and we're going to sell them in retail, and no one's going to drive again, or we're not. And so there's this time frame that's going to happen, and I wish I knew exactly what was going to happen, both for EV and AV. But I can tell you the AV piece of this, as we deploy next year in 2019 on a real network with people buying real services with autonomous vehicles, that's when autonomous vehicles were here, okay? People are going to do this very shortly. The retail piece of that is what, John, you're referencing. And the retail piece of this has to have the sensor piece of this solved from a cost standpoint. It has to have a safety case proven that a ride in an autonomous vehicle is safer than a ride in a human being, okay? And so that's a problem that needs to be shown, proven, and statistically valid around how the vehicle performs, and against a massive sample, which we have, of how people drive today. And so we need to make sure that case shows that an autonomous vehicle is always going to be safer than any one human being. And so those are the conditions that we deploy, and I think the adoption of that from a societal standpoint is going to depend on a lot of things, but even in the political environment we live in today, I don't know a lot of politicians that would take a platform that says that you can't have your car anymore, and you can't have your old car anymore, and you can't buy gasoline anymore for your car anymore on a 4-year electable period. I'm talking the truth here and being a realist. That's a pretty tough hurdle, and so the cost piece of it and people's pocketbooks is the other piece of it, and a lot of people don't have the means to afford a new car, let alone an autonomous new car. And so that dynamic is really important, because the last thing you want to do is ever take away anybody's freedom or their ability. What you want to do is expand people's freedom and ability. People who have gotten too old to see or too old to drive but still want to go somewhere and do it anytime they want. Those are magical opportunities, right? The mobility for my mom and dad, I'm very passionate about that. That's a huge deal.
So a major shift in retail would be an extremely gradual process.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, I agree completely with Mark that we have to think about this really in a couple different phases. In the near-term phase, the autonomous opportunity is really going to be around shared mobility and services, autonomous vehicles for services. And that's happening at about the same time that...
Like delivery, that sort of thing?
Well, delivery services, ride services, transportation as a service. And, I share Mark's passion for this because it's going to open up freedom for people that no longer either want to drive or can drive safely. Mm-hmm. And it's going to improve safety in urban environments, and it's going to improve the quality of life in congested environments. I really believe that, and we really believe that. But vehicles that you buy today, they're also getting better. They're getting safer because of the technology. A lot of the same technology that's going in the fully autonomous vehicles, we can commoditize that and drive the cost down at scale and introduce these sensors into these vehicles to make them better semi-autonomous vehicles.
Well, like the car that Mark said you drove here in today, right, was doing stuff for you that normally, 8 years ago, humans did all of. Right. And so... Right. There are cars that will slow down if they sense that you're getting too close to the car in front of you. If you cross into the lane, it'll bring you back. So it suggests to me that the move towards the autonomous vehicle is not going to be a day when suddenly you unveil the autonomous vehicle, but we're moving towards it in small steps, and we're going to be getting used to it in small doses.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really important. And unfortunately, with the way a lot of things are delivered today from a news and media standpoint, it seems like there's rarely enough time to have this conversation around what it really means and how we think it will roll out.
Right.
And instead it's a headline that says, you're doing this. And people walk away and say, well, I'm not ready for that. But
Right.
that's not really what it is.
That's right. There's an evolution and a revolution.
Yeah.
And the personally owned vehicles are really going through an evolution. I mean, you can buy Ford vehicles, and I assume GM vehicles, well, I know GM vehicles today. You can buy them today that do adaptive cruise control, that do lane centering, and actually will drive you on the highway without you doing all the tasks. And we have vehicles in our plan to have those capabilities get better and better and better. It's on the spectrum of autonomy, short
Yeah.
of full autonomy, where you still have a driver, but that driver is getting a lot of assistance from technology, a lot of help from technology.
An engineering society has come up with this scheme of levels from 0 to 5.
0 to 5.
Where 5 is a vehicle in which human interaction is irrelevant, doesn't matter, the car's making all of the decisions. And 0, unfortunately, we're 0. 0 is a car where
I'll feel good
we
about
do
that.
everything, which is kind of what we've been doing. I'm sorry that they call that 0.
No, it's 0, yeah.
That's what it is.
I just want to say, I'd love to go to questions, and if you can line up to the, mic's going to be brought down right now. Oh, I'm sorry, mic is being, yeah. If you go to this, to the both aisles, there's a mic right there, and you can line up behind it. Start on this side.
I'm really interested in the stuff that you're talking about.
Actually, your mic's not live
No.
yet, so
There we go.
there it is.
Now it
I'm
is.
really interested in the stuff you're talking about elderly people who are now imprisoned in their homes, being able to drive. My in-laws are among them. Can you talk a little bit about this challenges of creating vehicles for people who can't drive?
Yeah, I think if you look at this, what kind of vehicle that would be, we're actually looking at this right now in a big way. And so there's the need for assisted people, that are either using a walker, a cane, obviously, or a wheelchair. So the vehicle needs are known for what that means. And so it will dictate how the doors work. It will dictate, what the space is in it and how many people ride in it. It will dictate, a sense of comfort and safety, obviously. Those are all the things that whatever platform evolves from this, we'll have to take into consideration and make sure we nail that. Because if you look at the municipality of just Detroit, to be able to deliver a bus system and a mass transportation system in Detroit, there's a condition that that costs the city tens of millions of dollars to be able to provide assistance for the people who no longer can get assistance. It's really costly. It's really difficult to deploy, and it's just really hard for someone to be able to use something like that. And so, minus the ability of any city to be able to pay that kind of ongoing structural cost. Or rebuild an infrastructure. This type of thing unlocks an incredible amount of freedom for the person and the customer, but also the cities themselves say, I want this badly, because it's going to solve so many different problems. And so for a much lower cost basis and provide many more people the freedom to be able to be mobile.
Yeah, I just add that we've learned a lot from the acquisition of a company we acquired a couple years ago called Chariot. They do what's called microservices transportation. Basically, it's Ford Transit vans. Slip there. Ford Transit vans that are equipped to move people around a city, around an urban environment. And what we've learned from deploying those in the city is that the technology and the robotics that you need to equip vehicles with to enable people who can't drive and who want to use these services transcends the driving task. It includes loading and unloading, opening doors smartly. It includes enabling them to have the right kind of seating configurations, having good ingress and good egress. And including intelligence about where you stop to pick people up. You don't stop in front of puddles and things like that. So we're learning about the human interaction and how you need to bring technology to facilitate that human interaction to enable people to use these services when they don't want to drive or when they can't drive anymore because of their condition.
I think when you just said, don't stop in front of a puddle, like that's a light bulb moment of understanding both the challenge and the need and the goal.
Exactly.
That's a really good example. Right up here.
So what kind of new standards are you guys creating, I would hope, working with each other? Because for the last 100+ years, you've been dealing with a combustion engine that you can put a Ford in a Chevy and a Chevy in a Ford. But going forward, you guys are obviously in a race for technology, a race for design with Google, Uber, everybody else that's doing this. But at the same time, there's a responsibility that your cars are going to have to talk to each other, or someone's going to figure out something that works better than the other guy. And if everybody's going to win and you're going to standardize the roads, then there's going to be some sort of governing body or standardized system that all of these computers talk to each other on.
Yeah.
You can't have
Great
Mac
question.
and Windows.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let me start with that. So there's a need for collaboration on a lot of different fronts, and you surfaced many of them. But let me start with the policy and the standards around how do you get these technologies accepted and approved and authorized to operate. We think there needs to be some standards around that question, instead of every company trying to figure out how to do it and then convincing our governing body, NHTSA in this case, National Highway Transportation Safety Agency, that we've got it right. We think we have to work together to have that conversation. And just literally recently, over the course of this summer, we've opened a discussion with the Society of Automotive Engineers, who's going to help us move that forward as a community. So I'm really excited about that. You also surfaced the question around, the fact that the computers all need to talk to each other. Initially, I don't think that's going to be feasible. And in fact, it's not even required. But long term, perhaps they will be able to have this sort of vehicle to infrastructure and vehicle to vehicle standard dialogue as the technology matures and as the infrastructure gets the investment required to enable the vehicle to infrastructure communications to occur. The standards for having the communications work back and forth they're already in place. It's just a question of getting the infrastructure and the scale in place.
Over here.
Yeah, let me can I respond to that?
Sure.
I think we do collaborate on things like transmissions, so we are doing some things there.
We do.
And we've done some other things along the way as well. So there can be and will be. We've partnered with Honda on our fuel cells, and we partner with Honda. They're going to source all their batteries to GM, so for their electric vehicles, we'll be partnering with Honda to get scale and get design and cost. So the industry, you'll see this. You'll continue seeing this. No doubt about it. On the V2V piece of it, Toyota, I think, announced that in 5 years they'll have quite a few vehicles on the road from a vehicle-to-vehicle interface standpoint. We already have one in GM, and we'll have a bunch of other ones through Cadillac here in the next. So the protocol is there. The point is the protocol is there to have that. And that's a big safety deal. And so it's already started and more to come.
Ma'am.
I wonder how the autonomous technology is going to affect the trucking industry.
And do you also mean in terms of the employment
Heavy
of
truck.
truckers?
Yeah,
Impact on,
right, and
Yeah.
use of these huge trucks on the highway.
can I take that question and add to it? Not just on, if you impact the trucking industry by making redundant human drivers, what happens to the roadside diner industry and the roadside motels, and what happens to the insurance industry? I mean, where do the ripple effects stop?
We've thought a lot about this, and you could certainly envision trucks traveling without drivers. I mean, with autonomy, right? I mean, that's not if you're talking about the out years here, but I got to tell you, I think what you'll see first is if there's autonomy in the trucking and the big trucks, I think you're talking about, the big trucks piece of this, there's a great thing that this helps with, and that's driver fatigue, okay? So you can talk about full autonomy someday, okay? I don't have all the answers to that question, but I do see something like Super Cruise or an assist of fatigue helping drivers stay on the road more alert so that they're safer. I think there's a huge test case for that comes first, that says, you know, we're going to be able to drive our trucks safer when we're on the road. Because, you know, there's standards in place for this, but, you know, driving a truck with a load on the back of it, that's no easy deal, and a lot of different conditions. So there's a huge amount of opportunity to make those trucks safer before we get to an autonomous piece of that. And if they're safer and more alert, then I think they'll eat more at the diner. So.
Did you want to jump in on that question?
Well, I'll just...
And to maybe even play with the part of it I was talking about? Or is that, I mean, Mark is suggesting that's too far out to be talking about, right?
Well,
I
you
just
know,
don't know. Yeah.
I don't know if it's too far out to talk about. The way I would frame it is that it's not unlike any other major new technology revolution. I mean, if you think about, you know, we've asked that same question: will new technology in the TV industry, kill this part of the TV industry? And you could think of lots of proxies in the history of technology revolutions. And what we've learned from looking at those other proxies of technology revolutions is that, yes, it removes some jobs that have been replaced by technology, but it creates new jobs in other areas. Mm-hmm. And these new jobs in other areas, we believe, are going to be the jobs where humans are required to enable the interaction with the vehicle. So let me give you an example. We have in our plan to bring autonomy to our non-emergency medical transit service. We operate a non-emergency medical transit service today in and around the city of Detroit. And it's been a huge success because it's giving the ability to actually save lives and move people to healthcare professionals where they didn't have the ability to have that before. We're seeing that become autonomous one day. Well, that's going to take the driver away, but it's going to create new jobs for people to actually be in the vehicle to assist people who need medical care. And so we think it's going to give new jobs and new different kinds of jobs while replacing the jobs that are low, that can be replaced by technology, in this case, truckers. Sir.
Yes. You've spoken a lot about the innovation in your companies. Would you speak a little bit more about the reliance on things that you have less control over, like the technological infrastructure of the country or globally? For example, how dependent are you on the build out of the 5G infrastructure across this country or globally in order to be able to deploy these vehicles?
Yeah, Mark, why don't you?
I can do that. We're not relying on it at all because we're running right now off of the 4G LTE that we bring into the car. So that's how we're running it. And so if that happens and it's stable and it delivers everything that's promised, we're ready to do that. But we're not dependent on it, no.
So you can
I would say the same thing at Ford. The only twist I would add to it is we're watching it very closely, and in fact, we've joined the 5G Automotive Alliance.
Yeah.
I think GM's in it as
on
well.
it too, yep.
And because we want to be able to actually track it and shape it so that it actually would work for the automotive industry in a smart way. But we're not relying on it today because our vehicles and the autonomous ecosystem that I spoke about works just fine on cellular V2X and on the sensing suite that's on the vehicle.
We have time for one more question, and ma'am, you were there longer than you are, so please take it.
2 years ago in this room, the speakers said that there couldn't be much advancement in driverless cars until there was direction coming from our government about who the car would hit if the car had to make a decision. And that seems to have been lost in the great past. 2 years ago, it seemed very far in the future we were really going to have driverless cars. But is there any concern about moral judgments on what driverless cars do?
Well, I mean, I can tell you the way we make those moral judgments, we'll stop the car, always, okay? And so that's how we default. And the moral judgment piece of it, I always hear this one, which is, it confuses me a little bit, but like, would you rather hit a child or drive off the cliff, right? Stop the car, so stop the car. And I think you probably.
Well, I would add, we hear this question a lot, which are the sort of the classical the classical trolley ethical question. And the thing that is really, I think, is important to recognize is that these ethical dilemmas are created by people. And they're created by people because they make bad decisions, or they don't see the conditions that are the early signals that they should have seen, that by the time they recognize they've got to make a decision, the only decision they have is one choice of two bad choices. Fortunately, a properly designed autonomous vehicle has the ability to see and not ignore all of those early signals, so that you would hopefully never have a framed problem where you didn't have a good choice, like stop the car, or take a third path, which is avoiding both of the bad conditions. But to your earlier point, the point that you framed in your question is, do we need a broader conversation, including policymakers, to frame how we address these thorny questions? And I would agree that the answer to that question is yes.
Can we have you back in 2 years
And those
to do that?
conversations are actually taking shape
Were
now.
you here 2
We'll have you
years
back
ago?
in 2 years because we're out of time. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the lovely conversation.